There are so many ways to add a tooltip or a drop-down to an element in HTML and CSS. But in this video, I'll show you 3 different ways to do it. So let's set the ball rolling. The HTML document will contain this boilerplate. And inside the boilerplate, we'll have the head section and the body. Now the head section will contain the title elements, just as you see over there. And then the link to the CSS style sheets. And inside this CSS style sheets, you have some basic rules and styles for all elements. And that's all we need to start creating our dropdown. Inside the body element, create a div section and give it a class name of container. And this will be the containing div for all elements. Inside this div container, create an h1 element and give it some inner text of your choice. Now still inside the container div, and this time as a sibling to the h1 element, create another div section and give it a class name, this time of dropdown. And this div will contain the dropdown information. So give it some inner text of your choice. And this is the result we have over here. And that's all the markup we need. Now let's add some styles real quick. So inside the CSS document, target the body and set the height to 100 VH. Set the display property to flex. Set justify content to center. And set the align items to center. And this will centrally place our div container, both horizontally and vertically. Next, let's start the container div. So with my container class name, and inside the CSS with the dot prefix to select the container class name, set the border to 2 pixels solid. Set the width to 400 pixels. Set the height to 200 pixels. And let's turn the container into a flex box so that we can have better positioning over the flex items inside the container. So we set the display to flex, set flex direction to column, and set the align items property to center. And this is what we have over here. Now let's start the h1 element. So with my container class, any h1 element which is a descendant, set the font size to 3.5 rem, set the cursor to pointer, and set the margin to 15 pixels for all sides. Now let's start the drop-down menu. So with my container class, any drop-down menu class, set the font size to 2.4 rem. Set the border. Now let's go back to the container div and then remove the borders because we don't need it anymore. And set the borders of the drop-down to 3 pixels solid black. Now set the background to this color, or you can use any color you want. It's totally up to you. And set the padding to 20 pixels. And this will be for all sides. Now let's add this arrow-like tip to the top center of the drop-down so that it will look like the drop-down is pointing to the text. I will do this with the before pseudo element. So with my drop-down class name, with 2 columns and the before pseudo element, set the content to an empty string. Now let the background be the same as the background of the drop-down. And set the width to 30 pixels and the height also to 30 pixels. Set the position to absolute and go back into the drop-down and set the position to relative so that this tip we are adding will stick to the drop-down menu. Now let's position the tip very well. Set the bottom to 84% and set the left to 44%. And then we rotate the tip. So set the transform property to rotate at 45 degrees. And this is what we have. And add a border of 3 pixels solid. And then let's remove the border right by setting the border right to none. And do same to the border bottom. And there's the final design, the final basic design of our drop down menu. So the idea here is to hide the drop down div initially. And then when we hover over our H1 element, we make the drop down div appear. And there are so many ways we can do this with HTML and CSS. But in this video, we'll be looking at three main ways to do it. The first method is to use the display property. So inside the drop-down div selector, set the display property to none. And this will make it disappear. Now, when you hover over our H1 element, you make it appear. So with my H1 element, when we hover with the hover pseudo class, any sibling element, we target the sibling element with a tilde sign, any sibling element with a class name of drop-down, select it and set the display this time to block. And this is what we have over here. Now, when you use this method, the drop-down div is totally removed from the DOM. It behaves as if it does not exist. And you cannot select it. There are no pointer events that apply to it. Screen readers will not read it out loud. It is totally removed from the layout. Now, the trade-off is that you cannot add transitions here. Any transition or animations, you cannot add it here. So let's try and add a transition. Inside the drop-down div selector, add a transition of 0.5 seconds. And you can see that nothing happens. So that is the first method. The second method is to use the visibility property. So I'll remove all the rules I set initially. And now inside the drop-down div selector, set the visibility property to hidden. And this will hide the element. Now, when you hover over H1 element, any sibling with a class name of drop-down, inside this selector, set the visibility property this time to visible. And this is what we have over here. And now when you do this, unlike the first method, unlike the display method, the drop-down div still exists in the DOM. It is not removed. It's just not visible to the user. Screen readers will read it out loud. Pointer events apply to it, but you the user, you just don't see it. So that is this method. And the trade-off now is that you can add transitions, but it's not quite the transition we want. So let's try and add a transition of 0.5 seconds and see what happens. Now you could see that when you hover over it, nothing happens. But when you remove the mouse, the drop-down div stays for a couple of milliseconds or microseconds before it disappears. And this is not quite the transition we want. So that is this method too. The third method, which I think is the best, is to use the opacity property. So I'll again remove all the rules I set. And now inside the drop-down div selector, set the opacity property to 0. And this will also remove it or make it disappear. Now, when I hover over my H1 element, any sibling with a class name of drop-down, this selector, set the opacity property this time to 1. Just as we have over here. Now, when you do this, this method is similar to the second method. The drop-down div still exists in the DOM. It's still there, but it's just not visible to the user. And this time, you can add smooth transitions and animations. So let's try and add a transition of 0.5 seconds and see what happens. So we can see the smooth and fancy transition in this method. So this, I think, is the best method we can use to add a drop-down or tooltip in HTML and CSS. I hope this video helped you out, and if it did, make sure to hit the subscribe button and support us. Like this video, and see you in my next video. Thank you.